All right, let's get started. Welcome to the session on It Ain't What You Think. This is amazing time we are living in. Probably the best of the times and the worst of the times at the same time, isn't it? So I want to talk a little bit about where we are in terms of influence of AI and how can we actually comprehend this and move forward. So I want to start this by first a few quotes. I want to bring in the words of Gandhi to begin with. And he said, live as if you were to die tomorrow and learn as if you were to live forever. And I want to underline the second part specifically, which is to learn as if you are going to live forever. And I think that's one of the things that excites me in our field is I often say that I feel like the kid in a candy store because every day there is something new to learn, something new to explore. So that is the excitement. I also want to bring the words here of FDR, and he said the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And it's perfectly okay to feel that fear. That's a natural feeling. But if we can turn that into a positive energy, I think that would be really great. And then finally, I want to also talk a little bit about the current situation, which is demanding change and adapting to where we need to be. And let's be honest about it. It's really hard to accept new ideas, to accept different perspectives. And in that regard, I would say the words of Aristotle, he says it's a mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. And that's exactly what I want to request of you today, is you don't have to accept anything, but just entertain some of the thoughts and see if some of these things would actually help us to get better at what we do. So let's start with the very first question. Who here is fascinated by AI? If you can raise your hands. All right, so quite a number of us. Who here is fearful of AI? Maybe fewer of us. And who here is both? Right? Some of us have the dual feeling, isn't it? And who here will not raise your hand no matter what I ask? Okay, there's few of us too. So I want to first talk about the words of Arthur C. Clarke. And sometimes we come along people who have a vision of the future decades before the change were to happen. And back in the 1960s, he wrote a lot of things about science fiction. And very specifically, there are a few things he said that are extremely relevant to current times. And he coins them as Clarke's Law. So I want to talk about Clarke's Law to be specific here. And the first Clarke's Law he talks about is, he says when a distinguished but elderly scientist states that something is possible, he is almost certainly right. But more important, he says, when he states that something is impossible, he is very probably wrong. And I think this is the second part that we need to really pay attention to, because it's very easy to constantly be told that won't work, you can't do it. And that's when I think we should really do it. That's when we should really try it. I was on a project recently for a client, and one of the developers said, how about doing this? I said, oh, that won't work. And about 10 minutes later, he said, very reluctantly, he said, Venkat, but I just tried and it's working. And I said, I'm so glad you didn't listen to me. So it's important to really push the boundaries and try things because that's the only way we know what's going to work. And he says the only way to discover the limits of possible is to venture a little way past them into impossible. And this is something where we want to push the boundaries. I often say you want to absolutely go as far as you can to try things out, and that's how we expand the limits of what we can do. And the third law that he states is that any sufficient advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. How many times have we looked at AI and we have gasped saying, wow, how did it do it? It looks like magic. So that's very natural to have that feeling as well, oftentimes when we look at a certain technology. But it turns out that we have had influence of AI in recent times, but to ask the question, is AI revolutionary or is it evolutionary? And to look at it, especially looking at the changes that's happened in the past few years, it appears like this is a bit sudden in terms of and the speed at which the change has been taking place. But I'm going to say that things take time to evolve. Well, if you look at the history of AI, one of the many of the leaders, but one of them being Alan Turing, back in the 1990s, asked the question, can machines think? But he was very clear about it. He was very clear to say that machines would think not like we humans think, but machines think in their own way, whatever that way could be. And so, can machines actually think? That's a question he raised. And as part of that, he coined this as a Turing test. And the Turing test says a computer could be said to think if a human interrogator could not tell it apart through conversation from a human being. So you are interacting with the system, but you can't quite tell whether on the other side it's a human or a machine. Have you ever tried to say thank you, maybe, to a machine that's responding to you? And essentially, we're not there. I don't know if we'll ever be there, but that's a thought process to really consider. But the word artificial intelligence, or the term artificial intelligence, was coined by John McCarthy back in 1956. So this has been around for quite a few decades in terms of the concepts and the evolution of these ideas in various forms. And literally, thousands and thousands of people have worked on this, ever since, including Hinton, who won the Nobel Prize in 2024 for a related work as well. So essentially, this is something that's been around for a long time, even though we see a lot of rapid development in the past few years. So I'm going to say almost every revolution is an evolution for us, the humans, as it takes decades, if not even centuries sometimes, to gain traction. So speaking about traction, I think we can collectively agree one of the most influential inventions to humans was steam engines. But if you look at steam engines, it took actually centuries for it to evolve. So it's not like there was a night before a steam engine and there was a morning after. So this actually took about 200 years of constantly refining it and learning from the experience and evolving it. So this is something that took a long time for it to change. And the growth of things are pretty much like that things take time to evolve. But let's think about this for a minute. Imagine the year right now is 1890. Well, if the year is 1890, and if you step out on the streets, you probably are going to see horse-drawn carriages on the street, because that's what humans did at that time, is they traveled from place to place in these horse-drawn carriages. Now, if you go to any kid today and say, would you like to go on a horse-drawn carriage? They probably are going to be super excited about it. But the kids back then and the adults back then were not excited at all about it, because the horses were painful. Now, imagine this for a minute. If you are one of the owners of a horse-drawn carriage, or you wanted to travel between cities, you had to plan your trip. You had changing stations where you have to get down off one carriage and then switch to another carriage. And a lot of times, this took a lot more effort. And horses, unfortunately, did not just go on the streets. You know what they left behind as they went. So who here, raise your hand if you want to be the person who cleans behind these horses. I don't think anyone desires to have their job. As a horse owner, this was painful because horses become sick. They would die. So if you went to a carriage owner back in time and you talked to them, they would tell you they're just absolutely eager to get rid of it, because owning a horse carriage was expensive back in time. And of course, as we all know, if the year was maybe 1930 or whatever that you can think about, the streets would have these automobiles and people would be driving around in their cars. And as it turns out, back in time, I know this is really hard to imagine, especially with the fuel price that you see on the gas stations today, that this was extremely cheap. So if you were given an alternative between having a horse-drawn carriage and an automobile, in a heartbeat you would select the automobile because you didn't have to deal with the horses and all the things related to it. But you may say, gosh, that was very obvious then. There was a night before the automobiles, and then there was a morning after the automobiles, and everybody, of course, made the switch. But the reality was not exactly that. Now, this picture was not telling you the truth, because this picture actually is really this. So the streets actually had both the horse-drawn carriages and the automobiles for a good 25 years. Now think about that number for a minute, right? And 25 years is like when a child is born, goes through all the schooling, and gets a job and becomes a responsible adult. So that's almost entire generational transformation, if you will. So what took this 25 years of time? Well, that's because initially the cars were not that very reliable, and they were really hard to find people who can drive them as well. So that makes the question, in almost anything we see, there are three different groups of people, if you will. And that's true of the times today, if you think about it. The first group of people lived before a particular significant change. Those people were not affected at all because they did not see this really in reality. That's the first group of people. The second group of people are the people who were born after all this change. Like the kids today, they have been born with the internet. My children always have this fascination. They look at me and say, Dad, what do you mean there was no internet when you were a child? And they cannot believe that world exists before a time of internet. And they would ask me, what did you do when there was no Google? And how did you deal with the dinosaurs, Dad? They would often ask me. So it's very hard for the children to imagine a world without internet. So there will be a time in the future, there will be people who are born after the change, and they really live in that world. That's their world. They come into existence. The problem often is for us in the middle, because we got one foot in the old way of doing things and the other foot in this rapid change that's happening. How do we deal with it? So it's always this middle group that seems to really have the trouble. So we can learn from history, and there was that middle back in 1900 when there was horse-drawn carriages and then there was automobiles. And what did the world do at that time for that drastic change that was, in front of them? And looking back at history, those were these old people like me. And I am getting close to my retirement. And within a few years, I'll be done. And I can continue to write code the way I do. I've been writing code for about 40 years now, and I enjoy writing code. And I think of this old dude sitting on the horse-drawn carriage. What did they do? Well, these horse-drawn carriage drivers said, we don't need this automobile stuff. I'm going to continue to ride the horses. And they found that their salaries went through the roof. Why? Because they were experienced. They were riding these horses, and people who still had horse carriages and had to maintain them continued to hire them. What I'm getting to is, for the old people in this room, I've got good news for you. And there's nothing to really worry about, because I am not worried about it. I'm getting to my retirement. I'm going to have a great time leaving this workforce. There's nothing to worry about. But then what about these younglings? Maybe the people in the 20s and the 30s. And those people back in time, they realized they don't need to be riding these horses. They can start learning to drive this newfangled automobile. And their salaries went through the roof as well, and they had a great time. So the people who are young in this room, I've got good news for you, Because as long as you can focus on getting to learn new things, you're going to be just fine. Thank you for coming for this talk. I hope it was useful. Well, the point really, though, is that there is opportunities, and that's the way I see these things when you look at the transition that's happening, and definitely at least one instant of history has shown that to us. But then we often look at the history and we look at it as a snapshot, as one event that changed the world in a certain way. But it's almost never that in history. For example, you've heard the term best thing since sliced bread. Well, we always think about sliced bread as the ability to slice bread as a great innovation. And yes, it was. And humans have been using bread for nearly 30,000 years. But you know this term called breaking bread. Well, you sit down with a family or a friend, and what people did in the past is they would take a loaf of bread and they have to break it, because that's how humans really used bread for a very long time. And of course, there are ways that you want to really make it easier to use a bread. And so, as it turns out, the ability to slice the bread and the bread slicers really took time to evolve. And after this 30,000 years of breaking bread, the ability to slice bread, a device was invented back in 1912. Now, this is great. We have a way to, slice the bread. But unfortunately, the prototype and the blueprint to make the bread slicer got burned down in a building. Remember, they should have done a git commit, but they didn't. So this is one of the things we always hear, right? Make sure to have backups of what you do. They clearly did not follow the instructions. So that was lost. So they had to reinvent the bread slicer, and that took another decade. So eventually by 1928, a first commercial bread slicer eventually emerged. And you may say, wow, that's great, right? Finally they have a bread slicer. So there was a night before bread slicing, and there was a morning after. Well, if you were in 1930 and you went to a house and the host said, would you like to have a sliced bread? Your face would turn really, bad and say, a sliced bread? Why would I want that? Well, sliced bread was not desirable at the time of the invention. And this is one of the beautiful things in our lives, is when we solve a problem, is when we discover a whole slew of new problems. Now, think about this for a minute. You were able to slice the bread, but what happens when you slice a bread? It exposes the bread surface very quickly to the air. So sliced bread was tasting like sawdust. It's like eating this desk if you're trying to eat a sliced bread, because it would become very dry very quickly. So if you went to somebody and said, we like a sliced bread, they're like, gosh, why would I want to eat something tasteless? So now they had to go solve a different problem. How do you keep a bread moist after really slicing it? So we went from a problem of physics to a problem of chemistry now. How to keep this moist? And that took a while. And eventually when they figured out how to keep the bread moist is really when slicing the bread became popular. And again, you can see things just did not happen overnight. It had to be done and redone, and we had to discover these other problems and solve them as well. So what is AI really today? Well, clearly the term has been given for AI. Isn't it artificial intelligence? Well, I'm going to ask you to rethink about the term AI in here for a little bit. So I wanted to check how AI is doing. And I wanted to see if AI is really giving good results. I mean, I could go ask AI to say something about one of my good friends, and it may say things about my friend. But how do I know this is true or not? I got to go to my friend and ask this question and say, is this correct? So I was kind of thinking, how do I really know if what AI is saying is correct? And I realized there is one way to do it. What if I ask AI about myself? Because there is nobody knows more about me than myself. I can find out how much it's true So I asked AI, what can you tell about Venkat Subramaniam? And I was kind of curious, what's AI going to say? And it said, Venkat Subramaniam is an Indian American academic. Okay, it knows a bit about me. And it said the author who specializes in the intersection of technology and society. I didn't realize that's what I've been writing. That's pretty cool, I thought to myself. And he has written extensively on. I've written about 16 books. Maybe that's why it says extensive. I don't know what a good count for extensive is. I'll take it. And then it said, on topics such as artificial intelligence, data privacy, and the impact of technology on human behavior. I've not written a single book on any of those topics, by the way. And I am like, wait, that's a lie. But then I realized it's much worse than being a lie. Did you notice what it said? It said, I've written about artificial intelligence. It's narcissistic. It thinks that I've written about itself. This is worse than my president, actually. And it says, you have written all about me. And now I know what AI stands for. AI stands for alternative information, because it just cooks up stuff, and that's not literally true at all. Now imagine, I know what I've written about, and I can tell you that's a piece of lie, and I've not written any of that. But how do you validate what you are receiving, what you are looking at? Well, that's an alternative information, and that's my definition of AI. Well, not just only definition. But I was on a flight, and I travel a lot. I travel every week. And this was a few months ago. As I was on a flight, I realized I had to rebook a flight, which was for the next day. But this was a very long flight. And I was sitting there and thinking on the flight, how do I rebook this flight right now? Because I don't want to really delay this. And I realized I cannot use a phone when I'm on a flight, but I can use a chat. So I went to the website for the airline and I said, hey, can you help me to change this flight that I'm flying out tomorrow? But when I went to the site, I saw this message. It said, welcome to, and then it says in the bottom, please note, some answers may be AI generated based on the content. They may not always be complete or relevant. So check the source link for the most up-to-date information. Now, I got excited about this because this gives me a whole new idea. Because I can tell my boss, no longer can you rely on what I do. Whatever I create may be inconsistent, right? So the question is that what we have come down to? Where we are boldly saying, don't rely on what I create. Now, this can get actually quite unfortunate depending on what you're trying to do. So there was a gentleman who was trying to fly on Air Canada, and he went to the website and tried to book a ticket, and he wanted to fly in the next couple of days. And the ticket price was enormously high. And so he said, my gosh, this price is too high. And the website responded saying, of course, if you're going to purchase a ticket within a few days of travel, usually the price is very high. And then he said, but you see, I'm not traveling for fun. My grandma passed away and I want to go for the funeral. After all, as you understand, I cannot plan for a funeral months ahead and book the travel. I have to go for this funeral. And the website responded saying, I'm really sorry that you have a death in the family. You see, you are sympathetic to it as well. Can I take the flight and then come back and apply for for you to reimburse the travel cost? Oh yeah, this is I'm really sorry to hear it. Please do. So he takes the trip, comes back, applies for reimbursement. And of course, Air Canada said, heck no, we can return money that you use for travel that you completed. Well, unfortunately, the court of law did not see it that way. And as it turned out in this particular case, that the court of law said, hey, you can't just blame it on AI. You are still responsible for what your application actually does. So essentially, one of the things we need to be careful about is about AI, and this is the property of AI where it's arbitrarily inconsistent. So when AI is arbitrarily inconsistent, we are still responsible for what it does. We can't just say that's AI and walk away and relinquish our responsibilities. That's still us. We need to be concerned about it. So the question then is, oh my gosh, if that is the case, is AI good for anything at all? Well, I think there is one area where AI is absolutely incredibly good. And it is very good in identifying issues with code or issues with software. This is one area where I've looked at it, and it's absolutely phenomenal. So, for example, I asked the question, here is an expression A plus 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 B plus C plus A minus minus plus C. This is not just an arbitrary example. We had a production issue in a system where somebody had written code like this, and there was problems arising. So I was curious, hey, would AI be able to identify this issue? And it nailed it. It said the order of execution of the operation is not guaranteed. So if you're writing C++ code, C++ compilers don't guarantee in which order this code will be executed. In fact, Bjorn Strostrup in his book actually says, don't write code like this. Now, I was presenting this slide a few months ago, and there was a person who writes compilers for a living. And he came to me and said, that's not true. Java doesn't do that. Well, notice it also included C# and Java, so don't trust everything it says. That's true for C++, not true for Java. So again, it's inconsistent, but it does nail problems now really, really well. However, I say that AI is an awesome investigator. So this is one area where I find it to be extremely beneficial, is if I have an issue in my system, AI is an amazing tool to say, hey, go find what's wrong with it. And almost invariably, it's able to detect issues and find problems in a really, really elegant and fast manner. But what about writing code with AI? Well, we're all getting excited to write code with AI. I'm not saying don't, but understand what it does if you don't really put proper guardrails. So for example, I said create a function in Java using functional style to compute the number of occurrences of each number in a list. Not a complicated problem, right? So I want to know the frequency of occurrence of a number in a list. And the code it wrote was that. And I look at the code and say, what do you think? I would say, except for the stupid comments it decided to put on every line, the code is fairly reasonable. So I would say, hey, not bad. This is very similar to what I would have written as well. However, but how does it write that code is the question. And this is one of the things very important for us to understand. It's not smartness. It's not intelligence. What AI actually does is inference. And inference really is very different from intelligence. AI is an amazing pattern matching system or pattern matching engine. Humans are not fast, but humans are creative. AI is a machine, so it's extremely fast. You and I, no matter how hard we try, cannot be as fast as a machine. That's why we have machines to do things. And I say AI is an accelerated inference. And that's what AI is doing. It's literally inferring your question and saying, it's taking your question and saying, let me go find out all the code out there and see which code does something similar to what you want me to do. In college, by the way, we call it plagiarism, when you copy from other stuff. But we have come to agree and say, this is great, look what it dragged in. But then I said, in here, write a function using functional style to return the most number of repeated letter in a string. Now, the code it generated is the following. I don't want you to read this code. I just want you to glance it and think about, is this code good? Is it code horrible? Or is it really absolutely terrible? Now, you don't have to read a code to get a sense of it, right? That's what experienced programmers do. They can just open a file and feel the smell that comes out of it. So when I saw this code, I'm like, oh, dear God, no, this is not what I would let anybody write code. This is horrible. But this is the code it generated. But that is also accelerated inference. And essentially, this is the code it generated, but why? The reason really is when you give a problem to it, it literally goes through all the code it looks at and says, hey, look what I found. This is why they have this recycle button. You say, nah, give me the next one. And you go from one vomit to another until you find one that's reasonable, or you discard and go your own way. So it's purely an inference engine. That's what you're doing when you use AI to generate stuff. So essentially, that looks extremely complex. You may even ask if it's correct, but that's all it is. It's an inference. Once you understand it's an inference, you realize why it is generating code like that. And if all you want is code, you got it. And that is the whole point. If people are excited about AI generating code, you got it. It is going to generate code. However, if you care about correctness, if you care about conciseness, quality, expressiveness, then it's a very different question. So my recommendation today, as we know it, is the following. And rather than relying on AI to generate that stuff, you can be a bit prudent how you use it. So recently somebody asked me, you're a programmer, what do you think of AI? Will it take your job away? Just for the sake of records, this is the way not to start a conversation with a stranger, by the way. And when somebody asked me, I was absolutely not excited at all hearing this. But I wanted to respond. And I said, what can I say to this person about my profession? And am I worried about losing my job? So the response that I was able to provide was the following. When I ask AI to do something I'm a novice at, I find it awesome. I have no clue what I'm doing. And AI produces results. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. But when I ask AI to do something I'm an expert at, I find it awful. And to me, this is the part that really worries me. Because if I know what I'm doing, I'm not comfortable relying on AI. And when I have no clue what I'm doing, I'm super excited using it. So essentially, when it comes to AI, how can we rely upon it to what we do? Keep in mind, AI is a tool. And a lot of times, people tend to forget this. Of late, recently, as I'm traveling around the world, I've got people come to me and say, I'm using AI, and you know what? And they'll pause a little bit and say, you know what he is saying? Or you know what she is saying? And I pause them and say, excuse me, it's not a he, it's not a she, it's a it. And in English, we don't put gender for things. And I respect other languages where you may have gender for things, but we don't call it, I don't say hammer is a he, hammer is a hit, right? So essentially it's a tool, so don't elevate it to something more than it is. It is absolutely a tool, it's a machine, that's what it really is. And knowing it's a tool, AI is a tool, leverage it, but don't put all your faith into it. And essentially, I was at an event when a project manager came to me and said, I'm going to pose a question to you, and I want you to respond. I said, go for it. And he said, for those with no foundational knowledge, will AI cover their back? That's a question he asked. And my response is, your AI will not cover your back. AI is most likely going to expose your back in public in the most humiliating way when you don't have the foundation. So it may kick your back, it may be, and if you're not careful or knowledgeable, the effect may be actually quite not what you expect. So we cannot simply say, I don't have any clue, so I'm going to use AI. That's dangerous situation to be in. So I was kind of curious. I wanted to see what people are telling about AI, and I wanted to just find out, so I queried for it in terms of writing code. And then I saw this. Somebody said, using AI generated code will make you a bad programmer. I absolutely disagree. You are already a bad programmer. It's not going to make you any worse of a programmer than you already are. Our survey AI tool increase amount of bad code. I don't think you can increase it. We have a lot of bad code already. And so then I realized the situation we got ourselves in. I think we can all agree to this. Humans write bad code. Does anyone disagree? We all have seen so much code people have written, right? And you shake your head and say, my God, why did humans write code like this? God, why did you create humans who can create code like this, right? So we often look at all the nasty code we all have written for a long time. And AI was trained on the code written by humans. That's unfortunately the sad part. Now humans complain that AI is generating bad code. Well, it's very easy to see where this is going. That's called karma. Basically, this is really coming back to us because we did this. Because essentially, all the time we've been writing this code, and all the time we've been told, write better quality code. Did we ever know one day we're going to have a machine trained on what we created? So the problem is not that AI has not been trained, it's quite the opposite. The problem is AI has been trained way too much on all that code humans have written. They never said, read this code, this is good one, train on it. Oh, that one is an example of bad code, don't do like that. Instead, we trained on all the code. So AI doesn't have a clue to say this is good versus this is bad when it's generating the code. So, and that's exactly what's happening in terms of what it's creating. So the problem is really overtraining of the AI on all the code that's been written and it's been exposed to. So what do we do with all the situation right now? So my recommendation is, at least for now, use AI for ideas and not for solutions. So to me, ideas are extremely important. What do you typically do when you sit with your team of developers? You don't tell them, here's a problem, and I want an exact solution now. That's not the conversation you often have. Instead, you say, here's a problem, but what are your thoughts? Translated, that means I want ideas as to how to approach this problem. So the more ideas we explore, and ideas are good ideas and bad ideas and terrible ideas and exceptional ideas. And then we narrow down and say, among these ideas, I want to discard these, but I want to focus more and dive into it. So I find it super helpful to really use AI to generate more ideas. And as it turns out, solutions carry a larger burden than ideas in general. Things like accountability, reliability, correctness, maintainability. Would you sign off your name on it? A lot of things go into creating solutions. I invite strange ideas, but not odd solutions. So to me, using AI to generate ideas is extremely effective than to really commit to solutions with it, because I still need to support the solutions. I can't outsource my responsibility. And as a result, it can be used for the right purpose in general. But that's in the short term. But I want you to entertain a thought for a minute. Where would this be in the long term? We are beginning to see the power of AI, and maybe, or maybe not, one day maybe we can get to this particular point. So let's entertain a thought of maybe what it'll be in the next 5 years or 10 years and so on. So I would say AI is a black swan. Well, this idea of black swan is there was a time when humans had only seen swans that were white in color. Imagine the time the dude ran into a black swan for the first time. And it's like, gosh, that's impossible. And of course, metaphorically, a black swan are events that we never anticipated, but then they fundamentally changed everything around us. There are good black swans and there are bad black swans. Good black swans, Google, for example, the ability to search and access information, even the birth of the web or the internet, you could say they are mostly good black swans. Maybe you could argue about bad black swans, JavaScript. So the point really is you can think of things that maybe have caused more damage than good for the human society. I was kidding about JavaScript, only marginally though. But the point really is that essentially, I don't know if AI is a good black swan or a bad black swan. The history will tell us eventually. But it definitely is a black swan because it's fundamentally changing a lot of stuff. And every single human endeavor has started with failures and missteps. I don't think humans have ever done anything, period, where we did something the first time and it succeeded and we are done. And we always evolve and refine and make things better. And this is seen in almost everything we have done. For example, airplanes fell out of skies in the early days of aviation. Sadly, still they do, but a lot less. But we learned that, took the time to learn that. And every single accident was a learning experience. We went on to learn why it happened, we improved it. And, compared to driving, being on an airplane is considered to be much more safer today. And we got to that point, and this has evolved in the past about few decades, close to 100 years now. And this is something that we see over and over and over. We get better at what we do. And decades ago, we had a healthy dose of suspicion about compilers. Now, I'm assuming most of us in this room were born after compilers. So you didn't have to be convinced to use compilers. But if you go back in history, there were people in the middle of the compiler being created. They worked with no compilers, and compilers were being introduced. And they were sitting there and saying, oh, compilers, they would never be able to write code as good as me writing machine code. And there were humans who claimed, rightfully so, that they could write better machine code than compilers that came out initially. And you can look back at history. There were times when people were excited about this idea of a compiler. And this was a PhD dissertation where they were talking about creating compilers. And it's fascinating to think of the time before in our field, and that became a normal way to do things. And history after history, you can look at all these pieces of evidence, and then, of course, there was a time when we all agreed compilers are the way to go. You can never be as good, almost never be as good as a compiler. So the point really is, we did not become more trusting of compiler just with time. That's not the case. Compilers instead took the time to really become more performant, more reliable. And then they earned the trust by showing what they can do in a reliable way. So the compilers took time to get better because there was more time being spent in innovating. Compilers can optimize code, as we know, much better than most humans can do. And so we rely on compilers today compared to what they did a few decades ago. So my question to really think about, to entertain this thought is, will AI be the compilers of the future? And if AI is the compiler of the future, what does that mean in terms of developing applications? So let's rethink about what we do for a minute. Compilers don't rewrite machine code or bytecode or IL. Compilers don't take your source code and say, let me take this machine code and rewrite it. What they instead do is they blow away the machine code that was generated. And then they regenerate the entire machine code or bytecode or IL. That's what compilers do. And because they can regenerate the whole thing, they don't have to go modify existing bytecode or machine code or IL. So, will we be able to discard entire programs like we discard machine code and bytecode or IL? And that's a thought we need to entertain and say, what would happen if that were to be the case? But I want to think about it for a minute. What is the most important part of an application? With all respect, I'm a programmer. I love the code I write, but it's not about me. And it's a question to ask, what's the most important part of an application? And I would say the most important part is data, because data is the most essential part for any business. Now, sure, we in this room focus on code, but the business lives because of the data, because it's the customer information, the product information, the inventories, what have you. So data is extremely important. The next thing to data, or maybe equally important, is the business requirements, the specifications. So what if we can take the data and take the specifications and create the application code just like we create machine code? And once we do, if we are iterating through this and our business says we need to make a change, so what if we, in this case, completely discard the application code, revisit the business requirements as they evolve, and regenerate the entire application from the data and the changed business requirements? And I don't think we are very far from that, as long as we can get a bit more reliable way to confirm and verify that it's actually fulfilling the business requirements. And so where does that lead us in general? And I want to bring the words of Henry Ford. He said, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. I want to pause for a minute and I want to emphasize this because my goal is not to insult anyone here. But the key here is that we hear this chatter, which I think is rubbish. We are hearing people saying, I want programmer productivity. Well, let's rethink about it for a minute. Mind it, programmers are not horses. I'm a programmer. I checked this morning. I'm not a horse. So I'm not comparing programmers to horses, but metaphorically thinking about it. But what we really need is not faster programmers. I don't think we need to focus on that. So when people tell me, oh, I love this AI because we can improve programmer productivity, I think that's a wrong focus. I don't think we want more programmer productivity. That's not the goal. What we really need is a greater business agility. That's where our eyes need to be. I don't care, with all respect, I don't care about programmers being faster. What I care about is, can we deliver solutions more effectively, cost effectively, and faster to our users and to our customers, clients? That's the key, really, we need to be focusing on. So in that regard, I would say AI is a black swan, and it is here to stay. And the question is, how can we deal with it? A book that I've read a few times, it's a very small book, but it's a book that really helps us to rethink about the situation around us. This is the book called Who Moved My Cheese by Spencer Johnson. And he talks about these 4 characters in the book. These 4 characters live in a place where there seems to be infinite amount of cheese. This was us 4 years ago. We were looking at the hiring rate and the salary rate in our field, and we are like, wow, programming is a great position to be in. People were rushing to become programmers. The enrollment at universities were increasing. Why? Because programming jobs are really great to have. There's plenty of them. There is high paying. But then what happened? As these characters in this book realized, they came one day in the morning and the cheese station was empty. And it's gone. And there's nothing to be found. And so these four characters in the book, two of them are mice-like characters, two are more human-like characters. And how do they deal with this sudden change when there's no more cheese to be found? Do we want to be hem or do we want to be ha? That's a choice each one of us have to make. And nobody else can make the decision for each one of us. And we have to decide if we're going to be sitting there and complaining about this as hem does, or are we going to start looking for more cheese by ourselves and go through the struggle to find that as ha would? So essentially, the question we want to ask is, do we want to ride or do we want to be swept away? Because that's a choice each one of us have to make, because we are that middle group. We are right there in the middle of a change. We are not the group that exists before. We are not the group that is born after. This is the problem we are in right now. That's a choice we have to make. And Darwin is often misquoted as the fittest survives. But what Darwin actually said, he was very careful in what he said. He said that, of course, dinosaurs were really fit, isn't it? But the dinosaurs in our field may not really make it. But we can maybe rethink about how we can take this journey. And according to Darwin's Origin of Species, he said it's not the most intellectual of the species that survives. It's not the strongest that survives, but the species that survive is the one that is able best to adapt and adjust to the changing environment in which it finds itself. He was extremely careful with his words. And I think his words are very relevant to us, because everyone in this room, me included, probably will say, I didn't ask for this. Nobody asks for trouble. Notice the words he chose. He did not say what you got into. No, that's not what he says. He says to the changing environment in which it finds itself. You find yourselves in this environment, not because of your choosing, but you are there and you have to deal with it because now it became your problem, whether you wanted it or not, unfortunately. So, ask not where AI will take us. Instead, ask where you want to take AI. And that's one of the things I keep asking myself. Not what this means to me, but what can I do with this so I can get back on the driver's seat and take control of this? Because this is our future. We have to decide how to make use of this. We cannot be in denial. So for anybody who thinks this tool is not going to help us, we got to rethink about it. For those who think this tool is everything, that's even worse. I think we need to rethink about it as well. But we have to take control. We have to take command of this to move forward. So if your job is mostly typing code, that part of the job will disappear because we don't need to be typing. And typing code, don't get me wrong, I'm a programmer. I love programming. But if you honestly ask me, the part of programming I don't enjoy is the act of typing. Now, if you've ever seen me type, I can type extremely fast. Or my wife says, I type extremely fast backspaces. Fair enough. But the point is, typing speed is not a concern for me. I can type easily with 9 fingers. I've got practice. But on the other hand, to me, I want to develop code at the speed of my thought. When I come up with a design idea or an algorithm, or I want to evaluate prototypes, I want to do that quickly. What I get excited about today as an architect, as a lead, as a senior programmer, is this ability for me to really be able to try my ideas out very quickly. And to me, that's what I am as a programmer, not a typist, but somebody who has these ideas and solutions. And fundamentally, I'm not a typist. That's not my job. So if it is mostly problem solving, because I think we are problem solvers, not just coders. So if mostly it's problem solving, decision making, inferring context, leveraging proper tools to accomplish those, then delivering the results will be further enriching moving forward. And that's what excites me about all these tools around us, is that it finally gives me an opportunity to focus on what I truly enjoy doing as a professional. And it is really replacing not me, but it's replacing my manual efforts. And so I can spend more of what I can do better as a human and have the tool do what it can do as a human. So my call to action is to skill up, don't fear. So that is something we have to do, is to put away that fear, but to focus on skilling ourselves up, because the more skilled we are, the better we are in managing the tools, and we're going to get good things out of it. Thanks for your time. Hope that was useful. Thank you.